The groom left her at the altar till the Alpha King stepped forward. "Marry me instead. He's gone, Minnie." The whisper echoed through the suffocating silence of the cathedral. I stared at the empty altar, the scent of crushed white roses suddenly nauseating. Hundreds of eyes bored into my back, a chorus of pity and quiet mockery. Ernest had run. Just like that, I was the discarded bride. Before the humiliation could completely shatter my knees, heavy, measured footsteps echoed down the marble aisle. A shadow fell over me, cold and impossibly vast. Frank Bates, the ruthless Alpha King of the Northern Syndicates, stepped forward. "Marry me instead!" The stained glass windows of St. Jude's Cathedral painted fractured pools of crimson and gold across the marble floor. Minnie Cox stood frozen in the center of the light, her meticulously tailored ivory gown feeling less like silk and more like a shroud. The silence in the cathedral was not peaceful. It was the suffocating, heavy quiet of a disaster unfolding in slow motion. June Richardson, Minnie's maid of honor and fiercely protective best friend, stood slightly behind her knuckles white as she gripped a bouquet of lilies. It was June who had delivered the final fatal blow, a crumpled note found in the groom's dressing room. Ernest Howard, the golden boy of the Howard estate, the man Minnie was supposed to unite her family's crumbling legacy with, had vanished. "Minnie, breathe," June hissed, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "We need to get you out of here. Let the elders deal with this mess." But Minnie couldn't move. Her gaze was locked on Sylvia Bell, Ernest's mother, who was seated in the front pew. Sylvia's face was a mask of perfectly sculpted shock, but her eyes, cold and calculating, betrayed a flicker of triumphant relief. Sylvia had never wanted this union. She had always viewed Minnie as a lesser than, a desperate girl from a declining bloodline clinging to the Howard fortune. A murmur began to ripple through the pews. 400 guests, a mixture of high society elites and formidable pack leaders hiding in plain sight, were beginning to realize the groom was never coming. The whispers sounded like the buzzing of 1,000 angry hornets. Minnie felt the sting of tears prickling her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give Sylvia the satisfaction. She would not break in front of them. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral swung shut with a deafening boom. The whispers died instantly. The atmosphere in the room shifted, the air growing dense and electric, crackling with an unseen, terrifying pressure. Every instinct Minnie possessed screamed at her to bow her head, to submit to the overwhelming aura that was flooding the sacred space. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and echoing with the weight of absolute authority. Minnie forced herself to turn around. Walking down the center aisle, parting the sea of terrified guests without so much as a glance, was Frank Bates. He was a myth whispered in boardrooms and dimly lit packhouses, the Alpha King. Frank ruled the Northern Territories with an iron fist and a heart rumored to be carved from glacial ice. He was towering, his broad shoulders filling a bespoke midnight black suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. His jaw was clenched, his sharp aristocratic features set in a mask of lethal indifference. But his eyes, a piercing storm cloud gray, were locked entirely on Minnie. Behind him walked Gilbert Kim, his notoriously ruthless beta, whose pleasant, disarming smile never quite reached his cold eyes. Gilbert paused at the entrance of the aisle, a silent sentinel, while Frank continued his approach. Sylvia Bell shot up from her pew, her composure finally cracking. "Frank? Alpha Bates, what is the meaning of this? This is a private family matter." Frank didn't even look at her. He merely raised a single gloved hand, and the heavy silence intensified, choking the words right out of Sylvia's throat. He stopped 2 feet away from Minnie, invading her personal space, his immense height forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. Up close, the scent of him was intoxicating. Pine needles, sharp winter air, and the dark metallic tang of danger. He looked down at her, his eyes tracing the delicate line of her jaw, the slight tremor in her lip, the quiet defiance burning in her amber eyes. "Ernest Howard is currently boarding a private jet to Milan," Frank said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in Minnie's chest. "He took $3 million from my offshore accounts to fund his little escapade." A collective gasp echoed through the church. Sylvia slumped back into her pew, her face draining of color. Stealing from Frank Bates was a death sentence. "He left you," Frank continued, his tone devoid of pity, presenting only the brutal facts. "He left you to face the ruin of your family's estate while he plays coward across the globe." Minnie's chin trembled, but she forced it up, locking her gaze with his. Why are you telling me this, Alpha Bates? Have you come to collect a debt from a bride who has nothing left? A muscle feathered in Frank's jaw. The corner of his mouth twitched, the ghost of a dark, unpredictable amusement. No, Miss Cox, I've come to offer a solution. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently enveloping hers. The contrast was stark, her fragile, trembling fingers lost within his strong, unyielding grip. A jolt of electricity shot up her arm at the contact. A king needs a queen, Frank said, his voice loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear, though his eyes never left hers. And you need a shield against the wolves who are about to tear your family apart. The Howards have broken their contract with you. I am offering a new one. He took a step closer, the warmth of his body seeping through her chilled skin. Marry me instead. Minnie stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Frank Bates was dangerous. He was darkness incarnate. But looking into his stormy eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in Ernest's eyes for months, certainty. You want to marry me? She whispered, her voice barely audible. To punish Ernest? To secure an alliance, Frank corrected smoothly, though a flicker of something raw and territorial flashed in his gaze. And because I do not like to see beautiful things discarded. Minnie looked out at the crowd. She saw the shock on the faces of the elders. She saw the absolute terror in Sylvia Bell's eyes, and then she looked at June, who gave her a slow, decisive nod. Minnie turned back to Frank. She tightened her grip on his hand. Where is the priest? She asked, her voice suddenly steady, ringing clear and true through the silent cathedral. Frank's lips curved into a dangerous, devastating smile. Gilbert, he barked without turning his head. Gilbert Kim stepped forward, producing a leather-bound book from his coat. I am fully ordained, Luna, Gilbert said, his smile sharp. Shall we begin? The transition from the humiliated, abandoned bride to the wife of the Alpha King was a dizzying blur of ink, ancient Latin oaths, and the flash of cameras outside the cathedral. Before Minnie could fully process that, she had just bound her soul and her future to the most feared man on the eastern seaboard. She was sitting in the back of a bulletproof Maybach, staring at a massive, glittering diamond on her left hand that had replaced Ernest's modest sapphire. Frank sat beside her, radiating a quiet, oppressive heat. He was staring out the tinted window, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. The partition separating them from the driver was firmly up. Minnie carefully smoothed the voluminous skirts of her gown, feeling like an imposter in her own clothes. The adrenaline that had fueled her defiant I do was beginning to crash, leaving behind a cold, creeping dread. You're shaking, Frank observed, not turning his head. Bro. It's been an eventful afternoon, Minnie replied, striving for a neutral tone. Usually a girl expects a reception with bad chicken and an awkward first dance, not a hostile corporate takeover of her marital status. Frank chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that surprised her. He finally turned to look at her. You have a sharp tongue, Minnie. Ernest always described you as compliant. Ernest didn't know me, she snapped, the mention of his name sparking a flare of anger. And clearly neither do you. Why did you really do this, Frank? The $3 million? You make that in an hour. You don't marry a stranger over pocket change. Frank's expression hardened, the brief flash of amusement vanishing. He set his glass down and shifted, turning his massive frame toward her. Suddenly, the spacious back seat felt incredibly small. You are correct, Frank said softly, dangerously. The money is irrelevant. What is relevant is the power vacuum, Herman Brooks. Minnie frowned. Herman Brooks was a senior elder on her family's board, a staunch traditionalist who had aggressively pushed for her marriage to Ernest. What does Herman have to do with this? Herman is ambitious, Frank explained, his eyes dark and calculating. He knew Ernest was weak. The plan was never for Ernest to rule your family's estate. The plan was for Ernest to marry you, consolidate the Howard and Cox assets, and then Herman would manipulate Ernest from the shadows. By running away, Ernest didn't just abandon a bride, he triggered a panic. Herman was prepared to step in tonight, declare your family incompetent, and seize your assets as the pack's guardian. Minnie's breath hitched. Her family's estate, the land her grandfather had bled for, would have been stolen by nightfall. And by marrying me, by marrying you, I instantly merged your assets with mine, Frank finished, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes again. Herman cannot touch a single blade of grass on your land without declaring open war on me. And Herman is a parasite, not a predator. He won't fight me. Minnie absorbed this. Frank hadn't just saved her from humiliation, he had saved her lineage, but the relief was heavily tinged with suspicion. You protected me, but what do you get out of this? You're not a charity, Alpha Bates. No, I am not, Frank agreed. He reached out, his knuckles lightly grazing her cheek. She flinched, but he didn't pull away. His touch was surprisingly gentle. I am a king who has been ruling without a queen. The elders in my own pack have been restless, demanding I take a mate to stabilize my reign. They presented me with endless parades of vapid, power-hungry debutantes. And I'm not power-hungry. You, Frank said, his voice dropping to a whisper, are a survivor. I saw you standing at that altar, bleeding out in front of 400 people, and you refused to fall. I don't need a fragile flower, Minnie. I need a woman who can look a room full of monsters in the eye and not blink. Today, you proved you can do exactly that. The intensity in his eyes made her heart race. It wasn't love, it couldn't be, but it was profound respect. And in her world, respect was far rarer than affection. So this is a business arrangement, Minnie stated, trying to establish boundaries to protect her bruised heart. Frank's hand slid from her cheek to the nape of her neck, his fingers tangling in the loose strands of her complex updo. He pulled her slightly closer, his breath ghosting over her lips. The marriage is a contract, Frank murmured, his eyes flashing with a predatory, possessive gleam that made her breath catch. But do not mistake my intentions, Minnie. You are my wife now. You belong in my world, and I intend to make this very, very real. Before she could respond, the car slowed, turning onto a long, winding driveway flanked by towering wrought iron gates. The Bates estate loomed in the distance, a massive Gothic modern fortress of stone and glass. Welcome home, Luna, Frank said, pulling away and adjusting his cuffs. Minnie looked out at the imposing mansion. She had traded a cowardly boy for a dangerous king. As the heavy iron gates clanged shut behind them, sealing her inside his territory, she realized with a thrill of terror and excitement that her life had only just begun. The Bates estate was a masterpiece of intimidation and luxury. Vast hallways lined with dark mahogany and modern art led to cavernous rooms that smelled of wood smoke and expensive leather. For the first 2 weeks, Minnie felt like a ghost wandering through a museum. Her transition into the role of Luna was not seamless. The staff, loyal to Frank and fiercely protective of their pack's inner sanctum, treated her with cool, polite distance. They saw her as an outsider, a pawn Frank had picked up off a broken chessboard. The most vocal of her detractors was Ellen Stewart. Ellen was Frank's younger sister, a lethal, razor-sharp woman who ran the pack's intelligence network. With her severe black bob and eyes like chipped obsidian, Ellen cornered Minnie in the solarium on her 3rd day. "Let's get one thing straight, Princess," Ellen had said, leaning against the glass wall, a cigarette dangling from her crimson lips. "My brother might have put a ring on your finger to spite the Howards, but a piece of metal doesn't make you our queen. You're a liability. The moment you show weakness, the wolves in this house will tear you apart." Minnie hadn't backed down. She had calmly poured herself a cup of tea, met Ellen's glare, and replied, "I survived Ernest Howard and a church full of vultures. I think I can handle a few angry puppies, Ellen." Ellen had blinked, surprised, before a slow, genuine smirk spread across her face. "We'll see, Princess. We'll see." Despite the hostile environment, the most disorienting aspect of Minnie's new life was Frank himself. He was an enigma. During the day, he was the ruthless alpha, locked in his study with Gilbert Kim, managing a sprawling empire of shipping, tech, and less savory underworld dealings. But in the evenings, when the heavy oak doors of their shared master suite closed, the monster faded, leaving behind a complex, observant man. He didn't force himself on her. Their contract stipulated a shared bed for appearances, but Frank maintained a respectful distance, staying on his side of the massive king-sized mattress. Yet, the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. One stormy Tuesday night, a crack of thunder violently shook the estate windows. Minnie, who had always hated storms, gasped and sat bolt upright in bed, her heart hammering. Instantly, the bedside lamp clicked on. Frank was awake, his gray eyes alert, tracking her panic. He didn't ask if she was okay. He could smell her fear. Without a word, he shifted across the bed. He didn't pull her into a tight, restrictive hug. Instead, he sat against the headboard and simply extended his arm, an open invitation. Minnie hesitated for a fraction of a second before sliding against his side. He was radiating intense heat, his heavy arm wrapped around her shoulders, anchoring her. "It's just noise," Frank rumbled, his voice a soothing vibration against her ear. "The estate is built to withstand Category 5 hurricanes. A little thunder won't breach the walls." "It's not the walls I'm worried about," Minnie whispered, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling. "It's what's outside them." Frank's hand began to slowly stroke her hair, a rhythmic, deeply comforting motion. "Nothing outside these walls can touch you. You have my word." "You can't control everything, Frank." "Watch me," he replied, with such absolute, terrifying conviction that Minnie actually believed him. She tilted her head, looking up at his sharp profile. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked softly. "You have your alliance. You have your shield against Herman. You don't have to comfort me." Frank looked down, his gaze dropping to her lips. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, the storm outside forgotten. "I told you at the altar, Minnie. I don't like seeing beautiful things discarded, and I certainly don't like seeing what is mine in distress." His thumb brushed her lower lip. It was a simple touch, but it ignited a wildfire in her veins. She leaned into his touch, her breath hitching. For a moment, the dangerous Alpha King looked incredibly vulnerable, his eyes darkening with a hunger he was tightly restraining. He leaned in, their lips millimeters apart, the anticipation electric. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed at the bedroom door. Frank closed his eyes, a muscle ticking violently in his jaw. He pulled back, the mask of the cold king slamming back into place. "Yes?" he barked. The door opened a crack, revealing Gilbert Kim. The beta looked uncharacteristically grim. "Alpha, forgive the intrusion, but we have a situation at the southern docks." Frank sighed, untangling himself from the sheets and Minnie. "I'm coming." He paused at the door, looking back at Minnie, who was suddenly feeling very cold. "Go to sleep, Minnie. I will handle it." As the door clicked shut, Minnie realized with a jolt of panic that she wasn't just adjusting to her new life. She was falling for the Alpha King, and in a world built on power and deception, love was the most dangerous vulnerability of all. Over the next few weeks, Frank was consumed by pack business, dealing with a vicious turf war at the southern docks. The tension was put on hold for the annual Winter Gala, a mandatory display of wealth and power where Frank needed his Luna by his side. Minnie stood before the mirror in midnight blue silk, wearing the Bates family sapphire heirloom. Frank entered, his eyes darkening with approval as he placed his hands on her bare shoulders. "You are a weapon tonight," he murmured. "Stay close to me." The gala was a sea of fake smiles and whispered gossip. Everything went smoothly until halfway through the night, when the crowd parted near the grand staircase. Ernest Howard appeared, looking infuriatingly arrogant. Clinging to his arm was Lois Diaz, a notorious social climber obsessed with Frank years ago. "What is he doing here?" Minnie hissed. Before Frank could call security, Ernest and Lois made a beeline for them. "Minnie," Ernest sneered, "looking well." "And you're looking brave for a man who stole $3 million, Minnie replied coolly. Lois let out a grating laugh, placing a theatrical hand over her flat stomach. "Ernest didn't run from you. He ran to me. We're expecting, you see. He couldn't marry you with his true heir on the way." A shocked murmur ripped through the crowd. Ernest puffed out his chest. "I'll wire the money back, Bates. Now that I have an heir, Herman has assured my board position. Keep my leftovers." Frank moved with terrifying speed. His hand snapped out, wrapping around Ernest's throat and lifting him off the floor. Ernest's face turned purple as he clawed uselessly. Lois screamed. "Frank!" Minnie gasped, grabbing his arm. "You speak to my wife with respect," Frank growled, his voice rattling the chandeliers. "Or I will rip your tongue out. Your money cannot buy your life if you disrespect my queen again." "Alpha, enough," commanded Irvin Hayes, the neutral mediator of the Northern Pack, stepping forward. Frank held Ernest for 3 more agonizing seconds before tossing him aside like garbage. He calmly adjusted his cuffs and extended his arm to Minnie. "Are you ready to go home, my love?" Minnie took his arm, standing tall. "Take me home, Frank." As they walked out in dead silence, the rumors were already brewing. The Alpha King was violently, dangerously protective of his bride. The incident at the gala acted as a catalyst. Frank practically locked down the estate. Security was tripled. He was convinced Herman Brooks and Ernest were planning a coup, using the supposed heir to sway the traditionalist elders who favored bloodlines over Frank's ruthless meritocracy. Minnie refused to sit idly by. She sought out Irvin Hayes. Irvin was a man of the shadows, dealing in information rather than violence. Minnie met him in a quiet, heavily guarded tea room in the city, escorted by a begrudging Ellen Stewart. "You're playing a dangerous game, Luna," Irvin said, sipping his jasmine tea. He slid a thick manila folder across the table. "Your husband is looking for physical threats. He should be looking at paper trails." Minnie opened the folder. Inside were bank statements, encrypted emails, and medical records. "Lois Diaz is not pregnant," Irvin stated calmly. "She had a procedure 3 years ago. She cannot carry children. She and Ernest forged the medical documents to garner sympathy from the elders. But more importantly, look at the wire transfers." Minnie scanned the highlighted lines. "These aren't from Ernest to Lois. These are from Herman Brooks to Lois." "Precisely," Irvin nodded. "Herman paid Lois to seduce Ernest, fake a pregnancy, and convince him to run on the wedding day. Herman wanted to humiliate your family, break the alliance, and force a chaotic takeover. Your husband stepping in ruined Herman's timeline, but he hasn't stopped." Minnie's blood boiled. Her entire life, her humiliation at the altar, had been a calculated chess move by a greedy old man she had known since childhood. "What is his next move?" Ellen demanded, her eyes narrowing as she looked over Minnie's shoulder at the documents. "He's called an emergency council of the elders for tomorrow night," Irvin said gravely. "He plans to present Ernest's fake child as the true heir to the Howard Cox lineage, claim Frank's marriage to Minnie is unconsummated and therefore invalid under ancient pack law, and demand Frank step down or face a civil war." "Unconsummated?" Ellen spat, looking at Minnie. "Is that true?" Minnie flushed deeply but held her ground. "That is none of your business, Ellen, but the contract doesn't mean shit to the ancient laws," Ellen swore violently. "If Herman proves the marriage is purely political, he can dissolve it. Frank loses your assets and half the pack will side with Herman for the purity of the bloodline." Minnie closed the folder. She felt a strange, cold calm wash over her. She was done being a pawn. She was done letting men like Ernest and Herman dictate her fate. "Take me back to the estate, Ellen," Minnie commanded, her voice dropping into a register of authority that made even the hardened assassin blink. "I need to speak to my husband." When they returned, Frank was in his study, pacing like a caged tiger, Gilbert reviewing maps on the table. Minnie walked in and slammed the heavy doors shut, locking them. Frank stopped, his brow furrowing as he took in her flushed cheeks and fierce eyes. "Minnie? What is it?" She walked up to him and slapped the folder onto his chest. "Herman is calling a council tomorrow to dissolve our marriage and usurp you. Lois isn't pregnant. It was all a setup by Herman." Frank quickly scanned the documents, his face turning to granite. Gilbert swore softly under his breath. "He's going to use the ancient laws," Minnie said, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear but from the massive leap she was about to take. "He's going to claim our marriage as a sham." Frank looked up at her, the reality of the situation dawning on him. "If the elders believe the union is unconsummated, they will back Herman. The traditionalists have been looking for an excuse to oust me." "So we don't give them an excuse," Minnie said. Silence descended on the study. Gilbert suddenly found the floorboards incredibly interesting and quickly muttered, "I'll go prep the security teams for tomorrow." Practically running out of the room, Frank stepped closer to Minnie, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. His gray eyes were intense, searching her face for any sign of hesitation. "Minnie, do not offer this just to save my throne. I can fight Herman. It will be bloody, but I can win." "I'm not doing it to save your throne, Frank," she whispered, stepping into his space, tilting her head back to look into his eyes. "I'm doing it because I am your queen, and because I want you." Frank exhaled sharply, a sound that was half growl, half groan. He dropped the folder, his large hands immediately coming up to cup her face. "Are you sure? Once we cross this line, Minnie, there's no going back. You are mine. Completely and forever. I've been yours since you walked down that aisle," she breathed. Frank didn't hesitate anymore. He crushed his mouth to hers, lifting her off the ground. The kiss was a collision of fire and desperation, years of ironclad control snapping in an instant. He carried her out of the study and up the grand staircase, leaving the politics and the impending war behind for the night. In the darkness of their bedroom, the contract was burned to ashes, replaced by a bond forged in genuine consuming fire. The council room was a circular amphitheater carved out of dark stone beneath the city. The air was thick with tension and the smell of ancient incense. The 12 elders sat in elevated seats, looking down at the center floor where Frank stood, radiating lethal calm. Gilbert and Ellen stood by the doors, hands hovering near concealed weapons. Herman Brooks, looking smug and victorious, stood opposite Frank. Ernest Howard lurked behind him, looking nervous but emboldened by Herman's presence. Lois was conspicuously absent. "This charade has gone on long enough, Alpha," Herman boomed, his voice echoing off the stone. "You have seized the Cox assets under the guise of a false marriage, a marriage of convenience, unconsummated and devoid of the true pact bond. I demand the union dissolved and the assets returned to their rightful heir, Ernest Howard, who brings the promise of a new generation." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the older council members. Frank didn't flinch. "You speak of charades, Herman, yet you bring a coward to my feet and call him an heir." "The girl is Baron Bates," Herman spat. "Or rather, you haven't touched her because even you know she is damaged goods left behind by a better man. By pack law, the marriage is void." Before Frank could respond, the heavy iron doors at the back of the chamber groaned open. Minnie walked in. She wasn't wearing a gown or the polite, submissive clothing of a society wife. She wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, her hair pulled back into a severe, elegant twist. The Bates sapphire necklace rested against her throat like armor. She walked down the steps, her heels clicking rhythmically against the stone, projecting absolute, unwavering authority. Even Frank looked slightly surprised by her arrival, though a proud smirk quickly touched his lips. "I apologize for my tardiness," Minnie said clearly, stopping beside Frank. She didn't look at the elders, she looked directly at Herman. "But I was busy gathering the police to arrest Lois Diaz for medical fraud and extortion." Ernest visibly paled, taking a step back. "What?" Minnie pulled a flash drive from her pocket and tossed it onto the stone table in the center of the room. "I have submitted Irvin Hayes' findings to the human authorities. Lois Diaz is currently in custody, confessing to faking her pregnancy and receiving $2 million from an offshore account controlled by Herman Brooks." The chamber erupted into chaos. Several elders stood up, shouting. "Lies!" Herman roared, his face turning purple. "This is a fabrication by a desperate, scorned woman." "A desperate woman?" Minnie countered, her voice slicing through the noise like a blade. She stepped forward, letting her aura flare. It wasn't the overpowering, crushing dominance of an alpha, but the sharp, unyielding resilience of a Luna. She reached up, undoing the top 2 buttons of her silk blouse, pulling the collar aside to bare her neck to the council. The chamber went dead silent. There, resting perfectly over her pulse point, was the dark, undeniable, and freshly bruised mark of an alpha's claim. The mating bite. Herman stumbled backward as if physically struck. Ernest looked like he was going to be sick. "My marriage is not a contract," Minnie stated, her voice echoing with finality. "It is a bond. Frank Bates is my alpha, my husband, and my mate. You tried to use my heartbreak to steal my family's legacy, Herman, but all you did was push me into the arms of a real man." Frank stepped up behind her, wrapping an arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He looked up at the council, his eyes glowing with dangerous, victorious silver. "Herman Brooks is hereby stripped of his title, his lands, and his status," Frank commanded, the alpha tone forcing several elders to physically bow their heads. "If I see his face in my territory again, I will not be as merciful as my queen. As for Ernest," Frank looked at the trembling boy, run as fast as you can, because if my beta catches you, I won't stop him." Ernest scrambled up the stairs, tripping over his own feet, fleeing the chamber in utter disgrace. Herman, defeated and broken, was escorted out by the pack guards. The remaining elders hastily murmured their apologies and pledges of loyalty to the king and his new, terrifyingly capable queen. As the chamber cleared, leaving only Frank and Minnie, the heavy, oppressive atmosphere finally lifted. Frank turned her in his arms, resting his forehead against hers. "You," he murmured, a rare, genuine smile lighting up his stormy eyes, "are an absolute menace. You didn't tell me you were calling the human police." "You handle the wolves," Minnie whispered, wrapping her arms around his neck, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart. "I'll handle the snakes. We're a team, remember?" Frank chuckled, lifting her off her feet once more to kiss her deeply, the taste of victory sweet on their lips. The Alpha King had stepped forward to claim a broken bride, but in the end, he had found the only woman strong enough to wear his crown. Life rarely goes exactly as we plan. We map out our futures, the perfect wedding, the ideal partner, the safe route, only to have fate pull the rug out from under us. Minnie thought her world was ending at that altar, humiliated and abandoned. Yet, what felt like the greatest tragedy of her life was actually the universe violently clearing the path for her true destiny. Sometimes, the destruction of our plans is not a punishment, but a necessary redirection. The cowardice of an Ernest makes room for the strength of a Frank to step forward. It reminds us that we should never settle for a love that runs when things get hard. We deserve a love that stands firmly beside us, ready to fight the storm. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in unexpected plot twists and finding strength in your darkest moments, please hit that like button, share this tale with fellow romance lovers, and subscribe for more dramatic, heart-pounding stories. Until next time, remember, your crown is waiting. Sometimes you just have to survive the fire to wear it.